Racist bikers torment a black woman, thinking no one will stand up for her. But everything changes when her brother, Snoop Dogg, arrives to confront them. Subscribe for more and share this video to keep the conversation going. Latoria Broaddus sat by the window of the small diner, the fading sunlight glinting off the stainless steel counters and casting long shadows across the tiled floor. The town of Crescent Ridge was quiet in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. Nestled in the rolling hills of California, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or thought they did. Despite its picturesque streets and friendly storefronts, there was an undercurrent of tension that never quite left. For Latoria, this tension had become a constant companion. It wasn't just the sideways glances or the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. It was the subtle ways people showed her she didn't belong. Some gestures were small, a cashier taking a little longer to serve her, a neighbor who never returned her morning wave. Others were more pointed, like the spray-painted slurs on the side of her car a few months back. She sighed, wiping the counter in front of her for what felt like the 100th time that day. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of regulars nursing their coffee in the corner booth. She liked this time of day, just before closing, when the hum of the world seemed to quiet down. It gave her a chance to think, though lately her thoughts had been anything but comforting. Latoria had moved to Crescent Ridge a few years ago, hoping for a fresh start away from the chaos of Los Angeles. She wanted a place where she could live quietly, away from the shadow of her famous brother. Snoop Dogg was a household name, a larger-than-life figure known for his music, his charisma, and his unshakable confidence. But for Latoria, he was just Calvin, her younger brother who used to trail after her as a kid, asking a million questions and making her laugh with his ridiculous impressions. Here in Crescent Ridge, most people didn't know, or didn't care, that she was related to one of the biggest stars in the world. That anonymity had been a blessing at first. But as time went on, the town's quiet hostility began to wear on her. She had tried to ignore it, to focus on her work and her life, but it wasn't easy. The sound of the bell above the diner's door jolted her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see a group of men walking in. They were tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in leather jackets adorned with patches. Latoria's stomach tightened as she recognized the group. The Iron Claws, as they called themselves, were a local motorcycle club with a reputation for causing trouble. She had seen them around town before, usually in groups like this, loud and imposing. They took a booth near the back, their laughter echoing through the diner. Latoria forced a smile as she approached them, pen and notepad in hand. "Evening, folks," she said, her voice steady despite the unease prickling at the back of her neck. "What can I get you?" The leader of the group, a man with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck, looked her up and down with a smirk. "How about a little respect?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. The others laughed. Latoria kept her face neutral. "Our special today is the meatloaf," she said, ignoring his comment. "Anything else?" The man leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "Yeah, how about you bring it out here fast? Don't want to be sitting here all night." She nodded and walked back to the counter, her hands trembling as she scribbled their order. She could feel their eyes on her, hear the low murmurs and snickers as they talked among themselves. She focused on her breathing, trying to calm the storm of emotions threatening to break through. By the time she brought their food, they had shifted their conversation to loud, crude jokes, most of which were aimed at her. She set the plates down quickly, avoiding their gazes, and retreated to the kitchen. As she leaned against the counter, she heard their laughter rise again, followed by the sound of something falling to the floor. Peeking out, she saw that they had knocked over the salt shaker, scattering it across the table and onto the floor. Latoria clenched her fists. She wanted to march over there to tell them to clean up their mess and take their attitudes elsewhere. But she knew better. Confronting them would only escalate things, and she wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. When they finally left, they made sure to leave their mark. A crumpled napkin with a crude drawing of a swastika lay on the table, a final insult as they walked out the door laughing. Latoria stared at it for a long moment before grabbing it and throwing it into the trash. The next few days followed a similar pattern. The iron claws began showing up more frequently, their presence growing more threatening with each visit. They left scratches on her car, shouted insults when they passed her on the street, and made sure she knew she was being watched. Each act of harassment chipped away at the fragile sense of safety she had built for herself in Crescent Ridge. One evening, as she walked to her car after closing the diner, she noticed the same group of men standing across the street. They were leaning against their bikes, their eyes fixed on her. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. As she unlocked her car and got inside, she heard one of them call out to her, "Hey, sweetheart, where you running off to?" The words were laced with mockery, but there was an edge to them that made her skin crawl. She didn't respond. She started the car and drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she got home, she locked the doors and windows, double-checking each one before sitting down on the couch. The silence of her house felt oppressive, the walls closing in on her. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The fear that had been simmering under the surface now felt like a full-blown storm, consuming her every thought. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, but she didn't know what to do. The police had done nothing the last time she reported harassment, and she doubted they would care now. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Latoria made a decision. She wouldn't let these men drive her out of her home. She wouldn't let them win. But as much as she wanted to fight back, she knew she couldn't do it alone. Latoria woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. The digital clock beside it blinked 3:12 a.m. in bright red numbers, but the screen's glow was what truly pierced the darkness of her bedroom. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from another restless night. Her first instinct was to ignore the call, but as the phone vibrated again, dread stirred in her chest. She reached for it with shaky fingers and saw "Unknown Caller" displayed on the screen. Her pulse quickened. It was the third night in a row someone had called her in the middle of the night. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Heavy breathing came through the line, low and deliberate. Then came the voice, rough, mocking, and unmistakable. "Still awake, sweetheart?" She slammed the phone down, her breath coming fast and shallow. Her hands trembled as she turned off the ringer and tossed the phone onto the floor, as if that could keep the voice away. It didn't matter. She could still hear it in her head. First, it was the stares and whispered insults. Then, the graffiti on her car. Now, it was phone calls in the dead of night and the sound of motorcycles roaring past her house long after sunset. Latoria had done everything she could to stay under the radar, to avoid confrontation, but the iron claws weren't interested in leaving her alone. When she finally managed to fall asleep, her dreams were filled with shadows and voices, leaving her exhausted by morning. The diner felt different the next day, quieter, empty. Customers, who normally greeted her with smiles, now looked away. News of the video she had posted online, the one where the bikers surrounded her car, had spread. Some people supported her, but others saw her as a troublemaker. Maybe if you hadn't stirred things up, her coworker Sheila muttered under her breath as she refilled the salt shakers. Latoria clenched her jaw and kept wiping down the counter. She didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, she let her mind wander to the footage she had captured. She had recorded it out of desperation. Her hands had been shaking so badly she could barely keep the camera steady, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. She hadn't expected the video to blow up the way it had. Within hours, it was shared across social media. Messages poured in, words of support mixed with hate. Some called her brave, others called her weak, and the bikers, they called her out. Roughly scratched across the hood of her car the next morning were the words, "Snitch." Latoria had stood there in the parking lot, staring at the damage. Her stomach turned as the sound of laughter echoed from the corner of the street. She didn't even need to look to know who it was. The iron claws weren't hiding anymore. That night, she sat on the couch in her living room, staring at the video on her phone. The screen flickered, showing the circle of bikes surrounding her. The comments kept piling up, most of them supportive, but it was the threats that lingered. "We know where you live. You'll regret this. Leave town before it's too late." Her thumb hovered over the delete button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Deleting the video wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't make her any safer. For the first time in years, she thought about calling her brother. But that was a last resort, wasn't it? She had always wanted to prove she could handle things on her own, that she wasn't just Snoop Dogg's sister. She had built this life for herself, brick by brick. Then the phone rang again. This time she didn't answer. Instead, she pressed record on her own camera and let the phone buzz as she held it up. She needed evidence, more than just the one video. If they came for her tonight, she wanted the world to see. Hours passed, and the silence became oppressive. She sat by the window, watching the street. Every time headlights appeared, her breath caught in her throat. But the bikers didn't come that night. They came the next evening. She was closing the diner alone, her co-workers having already left. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for her car and the row of motorcycles that rolled in just as she turned off the lights. The roar of engines filled the air and dread gripped her. She locked the door and stepped outside, trying to look calm. But her legs felt weak, and her heart pounded so loudly she thought they might hear it. "Hey there, sweetheart," said Roy, the leader, as he stepped off his bike. His grin made her skin crawl. "We just wanted to drop by and say hi," another man added. Latoria clutched her phone in her pocket, ready to hit record again. "You should have kept your mouth shut," Roy said, taking a step closer. "People who stir up trouble don't usually last long around here." She didn't respond. Instead, she held up the phone. "You're being recorded," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Roy smirked. "Is that supposed to scare me?" He took another step closer, and this time she backed up. "You think anyone's going to care about your little video? Half this town's already on our side." Her pulse raced. She could feel the panic rising, but she refused to let it show. "You don't scare me," she said, even though it was a lie. Roy's smirk faded. "We'll see about that." He turned and climbed back onto his bike, but not before spitting on the ground at her feet. The others followed, revving their engines as they sped off into the night. Latoria stood there, shaking as the sound faded. She had recorded every second of the encounter, but as she watched it back, she felt no relief, only exhaustion. Back at home, she sat on the couch with her phone in her hands. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she had been avoiding. Calvin. Her brother's name stared back at her, and she hesitated for just a moment before pressing call. When he answered, his voice was warm and familiar. "Latoria, what's wrong?" The floodgates broke. She told him everything, the harassment, the threats, the fear that had become her constant companion. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "I didn't know who else to call," she whispered. "You did the right thing," Calvin said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm coming, T, and I promise you, this ends now." As she hung up, relief mixed with apprehension. Help was on the way, but she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Latoria woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing again, but this time the name on the screen brought a sense of calm instead of dread. Calvin. She picked up immediately. "I'm already on the road," he said without preamble. "I'll be there by this afternoon." His voice was steady, but she could hear the tension underneath. Calvin wasn't just coming to visit, he was coming to make a statement. For the first time in days, Latoria felt like she could breathe again. She spent the morning cleaning the house, as if scrubbing the floors and wiping down counters could sweep away the anxiety that lingered in every corner. But no matter how hard she tried, the unease remained. Outside, the sound of a motorcycle engine passing by made her heart jump. She peeked through the curtains but saw nothing except the empty street. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification. The video of her confrontation with Roy had spread even further overnight, shared by activists and celebrities alike. Messages of support poured in, but so did the hate. People she didn't even know were dissecting her life, arguing about her choices and taking sides. By midday, the tension in the town had thickened. Customers avoided her at the diner, and even Sheila barely said a word beyond the usual greetings. The Iron Claws hadn't shown up that day, but their absence only made her more nervous. It felt like the calm before a storm. It wasn't subtle. 3 black SUVs rolled down the main street, their tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. People stopped what they were doing to watch as the vehicles slowed to a stop outside the diner. Latoria stepped out just as the doors opened, and Calvin Broadus, Snoop Dogg, emerged. He was dressed in casual sweats, sunglasses, and a gold chain that caught the light. But there was nothing casual about the way he carried himself. The easygoing persona he projected on stage was replaced by something far more commanding. Behind him, 2 bodyguards stepped out, scanning the area with sharp eyes. The crowd grew quickly. Phones came out, snapping pictures and recording videos. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into loud chatter. Is that really him? No way. What's he doing here? Latoria's eyes filled with tears as she crossed the parking lot. Calvin pulled her into a hug, and for the first time in days, she felt safe. "I got you, sis," he whispered. But even as relief washed over her, Latoria couldn't ignore the way people were staring, or the fact that down the street, a group of men in leather jackets had started gathering. Calvin didn't waste time. After checking on Latoria and making sure she had security in place, he requested a meeting with the local sheriff. The call wasn't a request so much as an order, and within an hour, Sheriff Wallace, a balding man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, was sitting across from Calvin in the diner. Latoria sat nearby, listening as her brother laid everything out. "This isn't just some local beef," Calvin said, his voice low but firm. "This is harassment, and it's about to blow up if you don't do something about it." Wallace shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Now, Mr. Broadus, I understand your concerns, but these boys—" "They're not boys," Calvin interrupted. "They're grown men terrorizing my sister, and I'm not leaving until you handle it." Wallace hesitated, glancing at Latoria. "We'll look into it." "Not good enough." Calvin leaned closer. "You don't want this kind of attention on your town. Trust me, either you handle it, or I will." The sheriff left without making any promises, but Calvin wasn't worried. He knew how to use his influence. Later that evening, Calvin and his team headed to the bar where the Iron Claws were known to gather. Latoria begged him not to go, but he wouldn't hear it. "Stay here," he said. "You've done enough. Let me handle this." The bar was dimly lit, filled with the smell of stale beer and smoke. The Iron Claws were already there, lounging around a pool table. Roy spotted Calvin first, his smirk fading as he realized who had just walked in. "Well, well," Roy said, setting down his beer. "The big man himself. What brings you to our little town?" Calvin didn't flinch. "We need to talk." "Do we?" Roy leaned back against the table, feigning boredom. "I think your sister's already said enough." Calvin stepped closer and the bodyguards moved with him. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "This ends tonight. No more calls, no more threats. You touch her again, and I'll make sure the only thing people remember about this town is how you destroyed it." Roy's eyes darkened. "You think you can come in here and tell us what to do?" "No," Calvin said. "I know I can." The tension in the room was suffocating. Roy's friends shifted nervously, but Roy held his ground. Finally, he sneered. "This ain't over." Calvin didn't smile. "Yeah, it is." He turned and walked out, leaving Roy seething. That night, Calvin posted another video, this time addressing his followers directly. He talked about Latoria's story, about the harassment she had faced, and about the larger issue of racism and hate. The video exploded. Celebrities and activists rallied behind him, demanding action from the local authorities. News crews began arriving the next morning, and suddenly Crescent Ridge wasn't so quiet anymore. The sheriff was forced to make arrests. Several members of the Iron Claws were taken into custody, and Roy was charged with harassment and vandalism. But even as the legal process began, Latoria knew this wasn't the end. The damage had already been done, and rebuilding her life wouldn't happen overnight. Still, as she stood beside Calvin, watching the news coverage, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The morning after the arrests, Crescent Ridge didn't feel the same. The once quiet town now buzzed with reporters, camera crews, and spectators who had arrived to witness the fallout of the events that had unfolded. Police cruisers lined the streets, and uniformed officers stood guard outside the station where Roy and several members of the Iron Claws were being held. Latoria watched the scene from the diner window, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a coffee cup. It felt surreal to see the town transformed overnight, its usual rhythm disrupted by the flashing lights of news cameras and the low hum of generators powering mobile broadcast units. Calvin sat across from her, scrolling through his phone as updates poured in. His presence was a source of comfort, but Latoria couldn't shake the weight pressing down on her chest. Even with the arrests, even with the outpouring of support online, the fear lingered. "What's next?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Calvin looked up, his expression calm but serious. "We keep pushing," he said. "This isn't just about Roy and his crew. It's bigger than that. People need to see what's happening here, and not just here." Latoria nodded, but her gaze drifted back to the window. Outside, a small group of locals had gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. She recognized a few faces, neighbors, customers from the diner, but none of them waved or smiled. "It doesn't feel over," she admitted. Calvin set his phone down and reached across the table, resting his hand on hers. "It's not," he said. The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and media coverage. Calvin's legal team wasted no time filing charges against Roy and the other bikers, ensuring that the case would be handled swiftly and publicly. LaToria sat in the courtroom during the preliminary hearings, flanked by Calvin and his team. She kept her head high, refusing to let Roy or his crew see her fear, but inside, every moment felt like a battle. Roy's lawyer tried to paint the incidents as misunderstandings, claiming the videos had been taken out of context. But the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from the diner, witness testimonies, and the viral video of the parking lot confrontation left little room for doubt. Still, Roy remained defiant. He smirked at LaToria whenever their eyes met, his arrogance unshaken even as the charges piled up. The breaking point came when one of Roy's own men testified against him, admitting that the group had intentionally targeted LaToria because of her race and her connection to Calvin. The courtroom fell silent as the man's words echoed through the chamber. For the first time, Roy's confidence wavered. When the judge denied bail and set a trial date, LaToria felt a small flicker of relief. It wasn't over, but it was a step closer to justice. Outside the courthouse, the town's divisions became more apparent. Supporters held signs calling for justice, while others accused LaToria of bringing unwanted attention and tarnishing Crescent Ridge's reputation. The tension spilled over into the diner, where customers began avoiding her altogether. Even Sheila, who had worked alongside her for years, grew distant. "You should think about leaving," Sheila said one evening as they closed up. "This isn't the kind of place that forgets." LaToria stared at her, the words cutting deeper than she expected. "I'm not running," she said firmly. But doubt gnawed at her as she locked the doors and walked to her car. Staying meant fighting, and she wasn't sure how much fight she had left. When the media frenzy began to die down, Calvin prepared to return to Los Angeles. The morning of his departure, he sat with LaToria on the porch, sipping coffee as the sun rose. "You sure about this?" he asked. She nodded. "I can't leave, not like this." Calvin smiled, but there was concern in his eyes. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said, "but if you ever need me—" "I know," she interrupted, reaching over to squeeze his hand. They hugged tightly before he climbed into the SUV. LaToria watched until the convoy disappeared down the road, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The weeks that followed were slow and difficult. The diner remained half empty most days, and whispers still followed LaToria wherever she went. But not everyone had turned against her. One afternoon, a young couple walked into the diner, a black man and a white woman holding hands. They smiled nervously as they took a seat near the window. "We saw your story online," the woman said when LaToria came to take their order. "We just wanted to say thank you for standing up." LaToria blinked back tears as she wrote down their order. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The day the trial began, LaToria stood outside the courthouse surrounded by supporters. She felt the weight of the moment, knowing the outcome would set a precedent, not just for her, but for others facing similar battles. When the verdict came down, guilty on multiple counts, cheers erupted outside. LaToria felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Months later, the town began to change. More people of color moved in, and conversations about race and equality grew louder. LaToria expanded the diner, hiring a diverse staff and turning it into a symbol of resilience. She kept Calvin's picture on the wall, a reminder of the brother who had stood by her when she needed him most. And as she locked up one evening, she looked out at the street and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: hope. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If it resonated with you, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more impactful stories like this one. And if you're ready for more, check out our other videos. We've got plenty of thought-provoking content waiting for you.